You're listening to episode 19 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Lynette Monteiro and Dr. Frank Musten join us to speak about their book, Mindfulness Starts Here, an 8-week guide to skillful living. For many of us, taking an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program is a transformative introduction to the practice. Not everyone, however, is located near a program or may have other constraints, such as the time a program meets or the expense. Fortunately, there are other resources for starting a practice and maintaining it while finding a group to support your practice. Dr. Lynette Monteiro is a clinical professor at the University of Ottawa School of Psychology. She completed the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction in Mind-Body Medicine, the Practicum in Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction at the Center for Mindfulness in Worcester, Massachusetts, and professional training in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression relapse prevention. She is trained in cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive processing therapy for the treatment of PTSD in active duty and veteran police and military members. Dr. Frank Musten is also a clinical professor at the University of Ottawa School of Psychology. He completed his training at the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction in Mind-Body Medicine and the Practicum in Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction at the Center for Mindfulness in Worcester, Massachusetts. He has attended workshops on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and maintains his practice through retreats with various teachers. He is trained in cognitive processing therapy for PTSD and works with police, military members in active service, and veterans. Our guests today are Dr. Lynette Monteiro. Lynette, glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And Dr. Frank Musten. Frank, welcome to Present Moment.
Thank you. Hi, Ted.
Tell us how each of you first encountered mindfulness and how that grew with time. Lynette, let's start with you.
Thank you, Ted. I'll try not to take up the entire 55 hours here. I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia in 1998, and after 3 years of kind of denying that this was what I was struggling with, I went back to my old practice of meditation. I had done TM when I was a university student, I guess many years ago, and remembered that it had calmed me down. It had kind of really helped to steady me. So I'd gone back to that. And so, I'd also just started my private practice in psychology, and it all seemed to come together. I remembered a lot of things that had really helped me in terms of doing the meditation. Parallel to that, I had been trained in cognitive therapy. So what I was finding was that the whole thought challenging process in cognitive therapy, these are things were so much more accessible for my patients and for me in my own struggles if we had preceded it with a little bit of meditation. So this was all before I had heard about MBSR or anything like that. I was rather self-inflated in thinking I'd invented all of this. Lo and behold, I find out a little while later that there was this thing called MBSR. And so dove into it, got going into it, and actually originally MBCT, and totally fell in love with the process. It really resonated for me. And I was seeing tremendous positive changes in my ability, my resilience, my ability to handle stress. Frank may disagree about my personality changes for the positive, but I felt that things had changed positive. Yeah, and I think that's where it took off. When the MBCT book came out, it was so beautifully manualized that I dragged Frank kicking and screaming into this process, and we opened the clinic. And as we tell our classes, when we first start the class, the reason we opened the clinic was to ensure that we kept practicing and kept us honest. And I still believe that to this day. We're thrilled to have the clinic be 10 years old, but it really is a nefarious way of us making sure that we continue to practice.
Yeah, a lot of people get into teaching and writing for that very reason, because it is really supportive of our own practice.
Absolutely. You can't kid yourself about walking the talk.
You mentioned something, your diagnosis with fibromyalgia. I seem to recall that that's one of several illnesses that there are studies showing mindfulness helps with dealing with some of the results of that. Is that what you're finding as well?
Yeah, I think the toughest thing with fibromyalgia is, after you go through the denial process, you realize there's no cure. And the solution that you have is in learning how to live as skillfully as you can and to self-monitor constantly. And the only way you can self-monitor constantly in terms of being body aware, somatically aware, is if you're practicing. And if you're practicing in a contemplative tradition, that really, really makes a difference.
And Frank, how about you? How did you first encounter mindfulness?
I actually followed Lynette into mindfulness, but as she's missed a bit of the story, is that we were at a conference and she had been practicing for some time and just really desperate to find some way of organizing this. And I ran across Zindel Siegel's book, brought it over to her and said, look, here's what we're going to do.
That's his version.
It's a fairly good version, actually. And so right after that, people were extremely generous. Zindel Siegel, for instance, certainly said, copy the materials there, use it.
Oh, he was amazing.
Very, very supportive. And it was really only a month or two after that we rented some space in a local hospital, their conference room, actually, and began running a program. Probably we shouldn't have, but we did. And it was probably the most fun we've ever had. Both of us sitting there just trying to really be mindful in our own skins, while at the same time trying to convey that to people who thought we probably knew what we were doing.
Frank, had you had a meditation practice of your own for many years before that?
No, that's the honest answer. I've certainly done the kinds of things that one would call mindful. I like those sorts of sports that are meditative. I canoe, bicycle, I sit alone in the woods a lot. But in terms of a meditative practice, I'm fairly recently involved, very intensely involved, but fairly recently.
Or recently being about 7 or 8 years.
Yes, in our practice, that is fairly young.
And what's really neat about that is that when we're in courses, then it's not that I identify with people with what we're asking people to do. But it's as we're talking and doing the inquiry, what the obstacles are going to be because they're the ones you face.
Yeah, and they're very present for us. They're still very familiar to us.
Oh, yeah. Much too familiar sometimes.
Well, let's talk about your new book, Mindfulness Starts Here, an 8-week guide to skillful living. What made you decide to write it? What led to that?
Well, we started out initially as an MBCT program, and as we went along, MBCT at the time that we started out was very focused on depression relapse prevention. And of course, in our private practice, we see a large variety of people. So it was a more generic program we were looking for, and we adapted to meet the needs. As we went along, what we found was that there was nothing to support the kind of handouts, explanations, stuff that people could walk home with at the end of every class that helped them through the week. Because, when you're starting out with something like this, the first 4 weeks are a real struggle. Then, the light goes on in class 4, and then the next 4 weeks are just trying to learn the skills before the course ends. And we found there wasn't anything out there that addressed it in a very pragmatic, concrete way. This was long before the Mindful Way Through Depression came out, which also is not a week-by-week process. We also had some serious concerns about, how much of the secrets are you giving away when you put in a manualized format out there for the public? You go along with the dangers of people feeling like, well, if I just read this book and do it week by week, then I'll be okay. A portion of that is true. Yes, it will certainly help you. but it also helps to do this with the support of our teachers. So we struggled with a lot of that, but the bottom line was we had nothing that we could fall back on to guide our own participants through it week by week. So we just started writing. And we wrote the handouts, we did the various practice record forms and things like that. And we had the ethics, the value-based aspect too that we were folding in, which Frank and I were talking today about, the brand of our program. And the brand of our program, and as much as I hate the term, is that it's values-based, it's ethics-based. And again, we were iffy about that word ethics because you don't want to turn people off. But at the same time, how could we be transparent about this? So slowly, I think as we expanded the handouts, the book started to take shape. And initially, we just photocopied these chapters and handed them out at the end of every course. And then one day we kind of looked up and went, good heavens, we have a book here. Look what happened. And then the really hard work began of crafting it into a book format as opposed to, what we call the Frank and Lynette show in hard copy.
Frank, how about you? What perspective can you add to that story of how the book came about?
I think the book came about in many ways because, in addition to what Lynette was saying, it connects in a kind of a different way from the other books, in that it's very much a book that ultimately grounds people in the daily practice of self-care. And it allows them to develop a discernment in a progressive way that they understand. Most mindfulness interventions of this sort allow that to occur, but don't make it clear what's occurring. What we've done is we've articulated exactly, step by step, what's occurring. So there's a sense of knowing where you are and being able to say, okay, and this is the next step. Part of that takes away the mystery of it, takes away the mysticism, but also grounds it in a very real sense. And people walk away using the metaphors in their daily life. And so that they actually carry with them the kind of algorithm, if I can put it that way, that we created in the book. No one else does that. And again, you see people, and of course they keep coming back to our continuity programs, they keep coming back, and they continue to use the same language in order to actually anchor themselves, which we find really quite gratifying.
So you've taken a bit more of a step in the direction of clarity of what it is that's happening on a daily basis than we might see in some other programs. Are there other aspects to the book that make it a bit unique and distinct from others? And what's in there? What's part of the structure of the book?
Well, the structure of the book is very much based on the somatic focusing. So it is a building block process. And so the first standout thing, and what's unique about this, is that we treat the development of your meditative skills and your contemplative skills in the same way as anyone would be trained in meditation. So, we start with the body and then we go to the more and more nuanced sensation experiences week by week. And it's very above board. And I use transparent in a very positive sense in that people know exactly what it is they're expected to be practicing and being open to. In many of the other books that speak to mindfulness, it's more experiential, so it's a little bit hard to kind of pin down. And at the risk of ours being, fairly concrete and pragmatic, I think that's what people need, because meditation seems as Frank said, a mystical, strange process, a magical process. And what we're trying to do is get away from the magic. The other part of it is the ethics-based practices. So we take the 5 skillful habits, which is really, again, the keystone of the program. We invite people to choose particular wholesome behaviors and to practice them based on the idea that you can have an attitude of wholesomeness, but unless you're practicing it behaviorally, it doesn't get anchored. So I think our hallmark in this program is that we get people every week, and when they take it home day by day, to commit to their own well-being. And they choose very specific behaviors that anchor them in that well-being. So it's not just about talking about feeling good or talking about, gosh, I'm going to really take care of my cardiac problem, but about committing at the end of each class saying, this is what I'm going to do next week in terms of behaving with generosity to myself or respecting my limits or mindful eating or mindful speech, particularly self-talk. So for us, the 5 skillful habits is the foundation of the program where we see the most engagement from the participants, because mindfulness now actually it's got wheels. You know, you can take it, put the buggy on the road, and you can roll it down the street, and it all makes sense.
Frank, building on to what Lynette is saying, are there specific parts to the book that you can tell us a little bit about that help contribute to this practice, this formation of habits in a positive way?
Yeah, and I always like to start with putting a number in front of me and talking to the number. Say there are three specifics. The skillful habits specifically have people engaging every week on something they've chosen to do for their own well-being. So it really is highly behavioral, and it's something that they've committed to doing that they can actually articulate. And that's really important, because then they come back and report, and this is also important, and essentially report what happened. And as they're reporting, it allows them to actually practice internally the beneficial process that they engaged in. The other is essentially just making sure that on a regular basis, you stop and you check in just wherever you are and just connect with where you are. And that's particularly useful for people in the work setting when they're burning out, because it stops them as they basically recalibrate, to reconnect. And so they move consciously into the next moment as opposed to automatically, as we often do in a work setting when we're just going from thing to thing. So that's really important. The other one that's important is the sense of being able to discern the intent of what you're doing. So you're practicing with an idea of not only why you're doing it, but essentially what you're going to notice. And that's been particularly useful with military personnel, who I also treat, who are, as you might imagine, highly concrete and terribly skeptical. So when they can actually notice that what they're doing is changing the way they're engaging, and they can connect the two because they're discerning, that really lets them have a buy-in. And so in the main, people walk into our courses and out of our courses having felt they've understood how they got to from A to B. And that's really been satisfying for us.
So what did you find most difficult about writing the book?
I think the toughest thing was to try and articulate all these things that we've been talking about in the last little while. It's one thing to be chatting about it with colleagues or to be, teaching a workshop or things like that, but to actually put it down in those little squiggles on your computer screen or on my pieces of paper, language just failed me. And it was so easy to get into what I call sort of the Lotus Land speech when I was writing this stuff, that it was hard to kind of pull back and say, if I knew nothing about this, what would this sound like to me? And because these are so intuitive, such intuitive concepts and such intuitive practices, that to articulate it, first of all, almost seemed to diminish it. And at the same time, it was hard not to get lost in all the words. It took 5 years to write this. The first 3 chapters, and then there was a real dry period, and then there was this huge spurt. And I think we had to mature into the teaching to be able to know what it was we were trying to say. So for me, that was a huge challenge. It was just finding the words and making sure that the words didn't trivialize the process, because this is such an important process to convey to people. I was very concerned that we honored exactly what it was. Now, that was a hard balance to strike.
Frank, how about you? What did you find most challenging about writing the book?
My role in many ways was to find ways to challenge her thinking, so that as she was writing, she had to essentially convince me.
And we're still married.
And we're still married.
So it worked well.
Oh, there were ugly evenings. There were some ugly evenings.
I really don't understand this, dear. It didn't go over well at midnight sometimes. But I think in terms of our mutual contribution is that this book would not be recognized by our first students. And so it's been a maturing process over that time, and that we have integrated much new research. We've integrated a lot of trainings that we've had in between times, and we've connected with a way of being mindful and a way of teaching mindfulness that I don't think we would have conceptualized 10 years ago. So in some sense, the book has essentially emerged as a story of our growth. And what we have right now, obviously, is the next step to further growth. So we'll see what comes from that.
Well, mindfulness has changed too. all this time. I mean, the way it's being taught, the way it's being communicated, how widespread it is, and how common it is. When we first started out, no one knew what it was we were doing. We would, coerce people from our individual private practices into saying, listen, this is really good. Let's be our guinea pig for a couple of classes. And now we teach 6 courses. And our room only has room for about 12 people. But this last round, we had 325 applicants for roughly 60 spaces. And that if you had told me this was the way it would be 10 years ago, I would not have believed it. I wouldn't have laughed, but I would have had a hard time believing it. So, it's changed tremendously. And I'm really pleased with our product of the book because it reflects having grown with the science and the art and the delivery of mindfulness over the last 10 years. I'm so grateful for all the trainings we got because those trainings are included in that book. I think it's a remarkable confluence of things that came together at the same time. And it improved our marriage.
So other than an improved marriage, what are a couple of things you hope the readers get out of it? What's the best piece of advice you have for new practitioners of mindfulness?
Well, the main thing we really try to foster and encourage in people is to recognize that life will always be the way it is. There will be struggles, there will be joys, there will be sorrows. And to fully engage in this, we have to learn how to be steady and not be swept away by each and everything. And that's really what we see at the end of the course is that people, and it's so beautiful to watch, and people look at you and they say, I still have all my problems. And it's like the world is still this unfair, difficult, challenging place filled with, my children, my family, all of it. But I don't get stuck in anyone. And to me, that's like music, hearing that. It's like life hasn't changed, but wow, I can sit in it better.
One of the things that I think I hope and I'm fairly confident will occur is that the book is clear and it also is written in a way that it allows a relatively easy entry into a very difficult process. It doesn't tell you it's going to change your life. It just sort of lets you slip into a place where all of a sudden your life begins to change. I mean, every mindfulness practitioner knows that there's a half-life if you stop practicing, and that half-life is quite short. And so the process of a book like this is to provide the ability for people to begin reading, to become excited about the possibility, and then ultimately to practice. And so without the practice, the book really is not a very useful tool. So it's always engaging in the practice. And the practices in the book are sufficiently engaging and compelling that people sort of easily fall into them. They're fun.
I think that's a very good point, that the practice itself shouldn't be a drudgery. This can be done with a light heart. It's something we can look forward to.
And I think for us, what we really tried to cultivate, we do in the course and we really try to cultivate in the book, was the sense that you can design your practice to fit into your life. Your life doesn't have to change dramatically to include the practice. The practice must have ecological validity, and it must be something that you can do on a daily basis that enhances what you already do. There's nothing added. Your life is good enough and wonderful enough as it is. And I really hope we got that message across. I know we do in the course, but, when you put it down in the written word, and I think what worries me is that I can't see every person reading this book. I wish I had embedded a little camera in every book. I feel like, there are now all these people out there who have access to the practice in a way that is very pragmatic, very grounded, and is portable in their own life.
I think we've never had quite so much fun together as when we teach these courses because there's so much laughter. And we're drawing up in many ways upon the field of positive psychology, where we're always gravitating toward the strength. Psychology traditionally is what's wrong with you. And where we always are, at least in the courses and in the book, is that let me show you how to see what's right with you. And when that happens, then that's where you build from. So it really is a sense of not necessarily even a self-help book, but it's a self-awareness book that basically helps you be the person that you've always been.
You can find out more about our guests and their book on their website, OttawaMindfulnessClinic.com, which I'll be linking on the episode page for this episode. Our guests today have been Lynette Monteiro. Lynette, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Ted.
And Frank Musten. Frank, thank you for being with us as well.
Thank you, and bye, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.